This programme is the story of the worst peacetime disaster in Essex history, in the words of some of those who lived through it. It's dedicated to the memory of the people who perished in our county in the Great Flood of 1953, and to some of those whose voices you'll hear who've died since their interviews were recorded.
When I came out of the front door, I stepped down in the water, and because it covered all me legs, I went, oh, and a man went by and he said, "What's the matter, girl?" So I said, "Oh, it's cold." So he said, "That's not half your luck."
When I first looked out the window, I thought it was snow. I suppose the combination of the light being what it was and the reflection of the water suggested that it was snow, because I mean, you weren't expecting that. You could expect snow, but you weren't expecting to see water out there. But that's what it was ruddy water.
And in the front corner was one good lady sitting there. She was crying. And I can remember saying to her something to the effect, "Well, cheer up, my dear, we'll soon have you warm and dry." And she said, "No, it's my husband." And I said, "Well, don't worry, he'll turn up presently." And she said, "No, I left him floating in the water." Now, what could you say to a person in those kind of circumstances? And even now, it affects me when I think of it.
On the 31st of January 1953, there was a fateful combination of gale-force winds, a deep depression and a spring tide. A tremendous volume of water was driven southwards into the North Sea between England and the Netherlands. It resulted in a huge surge tide which raised sea level by 10 feet. The aftermath was felt along the whole of the east coast, from Northumberland to Kent, and in the Low Countries on the other side of the North Sea. There were more than 300 deaths in England. Over a third were here in Essex. The tide struck the county with ferocious force, breaking into more than 12,000 homes. 21,000 people were made homeless, and over 76 square miles of land were flooded.
As we came over the old Haven Gore Bridge, I looked out through the window and was quite startled and surprised to see how much water there was already in the creek, with the tide only about, should be only half flood. And here it was, the river was nearly full then. And anyway, I thought to myself, will probably be some damage come morning, never thinking about that the island would be flooded like it was.
On that Saturday afternoon of the 31st of January 1953, it was blowing a gale on Foulness Island. Leon Dobson noticed the high water level when he went to check his boat moored in the River Roach, unaware of the devastation that would follow. That evening, many of the residents of Canvey Island attended the opening of the War Memorial Hall, built to honour 57 islanders who'd been killed in the First and Second World Wars. Within hours, 2 more than that would perish in the Great Tide. Soon after 9 p.m, it was reported from Southend Pierhead that the tide was already coming in and rising fast. The Harwich harbour master noticed that the predicted high water level had been reached 3.5 hours early. A warning went down the line to the county's police divisions. As the waves swept in from the sea, breaching sea walls, people were woken up. Many stepped straight out of bed into icy cold water. Mary Johnson lived in Manor Road in Tilbury. Her husband was out on night work, but she was at home with her little boy.
My son was 3 then, and he called out during the night, "Mummy, you've left the taps on in the bathroom." Well, when I got up, thinking, "Oh, don't be silly," did never bath in the evening, had it in the morning. And I got up and I happened to hear the water coming, rushing, and went to put the light on, no lights, and the water was coming through the letterbox. I didn't panic, I had to stop and think, was it really happening? So I stood there for a while and thought, my God, what are we going to do? ran back into the bedroom, opened the window, and there was somebody, a police, walking, as best as they could, shouting out, "Don't panic, stay where you are, get upstairs." About, must have been about 10 o'clock in the morning, I could hear a voice shouting, and when I looked out the bedroom window, my husband was up the top the road trying to get through to us, and he had walked all the way from Dagenham, and naturally he was exhausted, and he couldn't get to us. The police were saying it's too much, it's too deep, you can't go down there. And then must have been about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a friend of mine, her brother, managed to get a ladder. He shouted to me if I was willing to come down the ladder, we would have a go at getting out, which I was. He took my Peter down first, and then he said, if you're willing to get down that ladder, I'm willing to hold it and wait for you, which I did. I came down that ladder, all I'd got on was I put an old skirt on and a coat, and he said to me, if you've got a belt, tie it round the waist so that when you get in the water it won't all float like, which I did. I came down that ladder, and he said to me, I can't do anything else, you'll have to take Peter, because he wanted to get some more people out. I had my son on my shoulder. I walked, because I lived in the middle of Manor Road, so I had to walk right down the other end where the police was waiting. We got round my mother's, and they was all so pleased to see me because I was soaking wet. Naturally, they said the first thing we've got to do is strip you. Well, taking into account my mother was 72 then when the flood was on, and naturally she never had no clothes that fit me. And yeah, she said, well, this will have to do, and she gave me a pair of an old women's bloomers with the elastic in the legs. Well, I put them on as upset, and I was. They said I'd done a little dance in them because it was so funny.
Harwich was the first town in Essex to go under. Built on a small peninsula jutting out into the Stour estuary, it was attacked simultaneously from east, north and west, and by midnight the quay, Esplanade and Bathside area were flooded and the pier submerged. Water surged into the town centre, flowed down streets and poured into basements, from the quay to the police station. The inspector in charge, the late Ken Alston, remembered that people didn't panic.
And an outstanding feature of it all was that the people themselves were calm. Stoicism, I suppose you'd call it. And they sat there patiently waiting to be lifted out of their bedrooms into whatever was going to rescue them. They had no idea. Looking out at first light, I looked across and I saw there was a little general stores at the back of the police station, and living with them was the father of the lady of the shop. And he was a retired seaman. I can see him now. He was sitting at a bedroom window with the window open, his shirt sleeves rolled up, calmly smoking his pipe and just looking at the water outside his bedroom window.
The total loss of life at Jaywick near Clacton was 37. Most of the houses in the little seaside resort were holiday and retirement bungalows built on stilts. They were engulfed by a torrent of water through a weak spot in the sea defences near St Osyth. Many of the wooden properties were uprooted and floated aimlessly in the water. Audrey and Derek Frost and their 1-year-old son were forced to spend from midnight until the afternoon of the next day on the roof of their home. It was held down by the weight of the concrete which surrounded it.
Being a small bungalow, the door opened outwards, and obviously the pressure of the water, you couldn't open the door. So the only way to get out was to smash the windows out and climb through the window section. And that's what we done. But as you smash the window in, obviously you get a great big torrent of water coming at you. So, that was very difficult at the time.
So he took Michael and he put him on the roof and I hung on the door, and by the time he got back the water was literally just up to my neck, and I thought, gosh, me end's nearly here, you know. Anyway, he came and he got me out, and we sat on the roof, didn't we, or on the lean-to. We were concerned about the baby, and so Derek said, I don't know what to do. He said, but look, he said, that's Rose up next door off of its stilts. He said, I'm going to try and get in there, he said, and get some blankets, which he did. We sat there, and it gradually got lighter. The wind blew, and you know, and then we kept seeing planes come over and waving, you know, thinking somebody might see us. But anyway, it just went on and on.
Sitting there in the dark through the night, you know, you didn't know how extensive the flooding was, and thoughts went through your mind that this was worldwide, you know, that this is your lot, really. So you didn't know whether you was going to be rescued or not, you know, until daylight broke, and then you could see land in the distance on the high points.
Then a rowing boat appears, and they had a job because all the fences, didn't they? And we're shouting, and they said, you'll have to wait, you know, because there was some people at the back of us. But we'd been shouting to them, but we couldn't make them hear. And we said, well, we have got a baby. And then George Ellis, the postman, remembered who we were, that we were there, and he said, you know, he said, we'll be right over.
They came across in the rowing boat and picked us up, and then rowed us across towards high land, which was very difficult because all the fences were obstacles in the way. As the water got shallower, the fences were nearer the bottom of the boat. Then once we hit the dry land on the road along the seafront, which was dry, we got out the rowing boat and got into a van, which was the local grocery van, I believe, and he drove us along to the corner of Golf Green Road where the water was. We met the water again, and then we were rowed in another boat down to Golf Green Garage, and on the hill there the ambulances were waiting to take us, you know, to the Alton Hall Hotel.
Foulness Island was completely cut off by the great tide of 1953. The sea walls had been overtopped by vicious waves raised by the wind. By 2 a.m. the only road connecting it to the mainland was underwater. Leon Dobson ventured through the flood to the quay.
I got on top of the quay, and what a sight it was to behold. It looked like the North Sea when I looked across towards Burnham and Canewden. You know, white-capped waves rolling, and like it does in a gale, but it was the distance of water what shook me really, and it wasn't much better behind me on Foulness when I looked back then, because the water by then was coming in again on the east side of the island, which is where the seawall had been badly breached to the east and the north. Everything that could float had arrived there, from haystacks to beehives and thousands of feet of timber from David and Armitage, as it was known as then, from Wallasey Bay, all piled up on the sea wall, you know, farm implements, you name it, anything was there. And dead animals as well, you know, that had washed off of Wallasey.
One of the most remarkable stories of the 1953 floods was nothing short of a miracle. Ernie and Joan Foster were drowned on the Newlands estate on Canvey Island, but their newly born daughter Linda survived. Iris Collier lived across the road.
Opposite me was Joan and Ernie and their little baby. She'd only had the baby about a week. And they obviously ran out onto their veranda, was going round to their mother, her mother, who lived in the next turning. It was awful. I kept hearing her screaming and calling me, and I couldn't do anything to save her. But by the time they got onto the veranda, because obviously the water was so high that they just drowned the pair of them. It was so cold, the water, for January. But the baby they'd put into a pram, into the big pram, the big bassinet, and the next morning the bassinet was floating on the veranda in the water. And the man on the houseboat in Chutes Creek at the back of us, he rowed over to us in a little rowing boat. He got us out of the little window in the loft onto his boat. Then he went back to get the baby, because I told him, I said, I saw the pram floating. Like, he said he'd go back and get the baby, which he did. Well, as it happens, I'd grabbed a bottle with about that much milk in with a teat on for my baby. And they reckon that bottle with that teat on, what they used the next morning to give to the baby, saved the baby's life.
At Oxenham Farm at Great Wakering there was a comical sight whilst the occupants were climbing down a rope from the farmhouse window into an awaiting boat. John Threadgold, the farmer's son, explains.
The cowman's wife, she was rather a short, dumpy lady, and had trouble getting her out, and when she was coming out through the window, she caught the leg of her bloomers on the hook on the windowsill, and there she was with these three blokes down and she was a little bit embarrassed, I think, but anyway, she got down all right in the end.
The late Don Harmer was a 21-year-old police constable. He later won a commendation for bravery from the Queen after crawling for more than 12 hours in the dark from Jaywick to Clacton to get help. He managed to get through the water onto the sea wall.
I got up on there, and it wasn't that bad. I mean, the water was coming over the top, but as long as you could cling on to the brick part of the thing, and when they departed, you could see where you were going for a bit, and you would hang on and realise that, you could go another 50 yards. And this is all right, but in parts, the inundation of the back end of the backside was quite deep. It wasn't that comfortable, and it was extremely cold. And I stayed up there till I could see these Martello Towers. And I thought, well, that's all right, I haven't got very far to go from here at all. Unfortunately, I didn't realise that there's a mile and a distance between the two Martello Towers. And I kept thinking, sooner or later, I'm going to get to the end of this. I got all the way along the wall, realised I was getting then to the camp, and curiously it was easy for me, looking into the dark. I could see the railings or the wire. I knew that if I could get onto that and I clung to the wire, sooner or later I must get out of the water. So I just went along. So when I got to the far end, the right end by the camp, then I was a bit fogged because I couldn't really see how I was going to get from the wire to the street. And then I saw cars go past. Although there was a lot of water tearing past me then at that point, going back into the sea, I thought, providing I didn't slip, then I could probably get along, trying to keep then as far as away from the sea as I could. And I eventually got up to the telephone box, and I thought I was doing really well at this time, so I telephoned Clacton and started to tell them how I was doing, what was happening, how many people there, what would be required. And they said, great, well, go back and find the inspector. Well, I was 20 years old, and if someone gave you an instruction that you were to go back, then that's just what you did.
At Parkston Quay near Harwich, the railway embankment was breached at both ends. Track and sleepers were swept up the streets of Parkston village. The water had risen to 5.5 feet deep in Bill Rowland's house. His son had just had his 7th birthday, and he was worried about his brand new bike.
In those days I had a Lino runner down my hall, and unthinkingly I came down the stairs and I could see this bike standing sort of submerged in water, and I could also see the lino runner. And like a silly man, I trod on the lino, and of course you can imagine I did a complete somersault because that lino was just resting on the top of the water. And I finished up in this absolutely icy water, frozen to the bone I was. And I got the bike anyway and got it upstairs, which satisfied my son and rather satisfied me. And then my wife wrapped me up in blankets because my legs had gone absolutely numb. Anyway, the tide was then receding out of the back way, out of the back garden. I looked at the back garden, and my son had left a football he'd had purchased him out in the back garden, and it was going out with the tide, and he was crying his eyes out. Dad, he said, I'm losing my football, I'm losing my football. And once again, I was 36 years of age, and like a twit, I came out here, managed to get my back door. I dived into the water and I swam after this football, and eventually caught it up and brought it back and got in the house. And once again, I was absolutely frozen, you know.
It was Canvey Island which gripped the nation's attention as the full horror of what happened during the early hours of the 1st of February 1953 became known. By midnight, the sea was flowing over the low and decrepit Chooks Creek embankment like a waterfall. People had to fight for their lives, particularly in the sunken marsh area on the Newlands estate. The island's sea defences were breached in 40 places, and dikes became invisible in the huge expanse of water. The late Reg Stevens was Canvey Urban Council's engineer and surveyor. He took command of the situation and made the momentous decision to evacuate the island's 10,000 residents. An operations centre was set up at the council offices and the fire service was mobilised.
The first concern was to try and make as much noise as possible in order to get people awake at this ghastly hour. At the time there was a howling gale and snow flurries in the wind. It was really very, very cold. I asked that the sirens, which were used during war as air raid sirens and later used to call out the fire brigade during daylight hours, that they be sounded and using the old wailing note of the wartime air raid. This was done, but again, the penetration of this noise into the wind was comparatively small. And so I asked them then to fire some maroons. The next move was to try to contact someone in authority at police headquarters to inform them of the situation. This I did through the telephone operator. Very shortly after this, the telephone exchange went out of operation. The telephone operator had stayed sitting in water until his equipment ceased to function due to the depth of flood water. He really was a hero. And we were then without any communication until the ambulance driver came to me and said that during the week before, his ambulance had been fitted with a radio. And eventually, through the radio link with the county ambulance headquarters, I was able to get a message to Bernard Brain, our Member of Parliament.
I lived in Leigh in those days, went to bed at the normal time. It was quite clear there was quite a storm raging, and I was awakened in the very early hours by a police officer. He said a message has come through that Canvey is being flooded, and people want you to come down. I said, of course, and he took me down. And, of course, people were still coming off the island, but it was pretty clear from what I heard from council officials and others, and some of the survivors, that a terrible disaster had hit the island.
At Great Wakering there was a temporary housing estate of 34 Nissen huts in a hollow in the middle of the common. People were trapped in their homes as water poured through an enormous breach in the sea wall at Morins Point, rising almost up to roof level. The late Sammy Sampson, who lived nearby, was woken up by voices carried by the wind crying out for help. A good sailor, he got a boat and rescued or recovered up to 30 people. He was one of the real heroes.
I went to another one and she said, I can't come. She said, I'm not dressed. I said, don't worry about that, I said. She said, go to that other one. Said, I haven't heard any cries from them for a long while. So I went to this bungalow and I couldn't see, but I looked on, I see a little hole in the roof. So I got on the roof and I looked down, and there was a chap stood, I don't know who he's standing on, maybe a stove, and he had a little babe in his arms and a child in his hand, and that lady in the water, bubbles coming out of his mouth. I said to him, can you give me the baby's hand? He gave me the baby's hand, and I picked it up, but I knew that was too late, but I took it in the boat, and then I got the girl, and I said, well, I'll take these to the bank, and I'll come back and get you. And the fireman was there, and I said, will you help me, Bob? I said, there's a chap there, I can't get him out. And he came back, and he made the hole bigger in the roof. We got him on the top. He said, take me boots off. Then we took him ashore. Well, I had one more when the wind blowed me down to the end with these 3 people on. I had a little headrest in the boat, and I said to the boy, well, take it round the chimney and hold it, and I'll get in the stem of the boat. And I said to the bloke, now you get your wife and slide her down my back into the boat, which he did, but unfortunately he fell off the roof. He naturally grabbed hold of the boat, half full of water, you see, and his wife was awash in the boat. And I slung myself one side to keep it upright, but he managed to get up on the roof. I went ashore with the boat. They had to drag his wife over the field because it was a ploughed field with 2 or 3 inches of water, you see, and tipped the water out, and I went back and got him. Then I had to get the boy, but that's when my trouble was, because he had to let go of the rope. On the boat there was about an inch of gunnel each side, so I got my knees under the gunnel each side and held on the gutter. And I said to him, as soon as you leave go that rope, slide down my back quick, as we should both be in the water.
On the 2nd of February 1953, BBC radio reporter Charles Gardner described the scene from the air as he flew over the east coast.
Well, the map of eastern England at this moment has been changed. The familiar curve of East Anglia, the estuaries, the Thames Mouth Islands, firm enough lines in your atlas, now have no boundaries but at the will of the sea. You can only tell for stretches of mile after mile where the coast used to be by jobbing backwards to it from some landmark that is still above the waters. You've got to see roofs sticking out of the water to realise that this isn't a pretty bit of scenery, but it's the end of people's homes, the end of their way of living, and, in many cases, the end of their lives. This has been an upheaval of nature, the sort of thing we see on the films, and it's happened here in England on the doorstep of London. But at Canvey Island, it starts to come home, this business in its sinister terror. Neat rows of houses, people's homes, awash. The grey, brown, swilling waters flap and swirl round a centre of life that has so clearly been stricken dead. And then Foulness, and here there seemed the greatest smash of all. The seawall crushed and flattened, the airfield marked only by the tops of hangars and bits of aeroplane that swilled around, and the farms, just the tops of houses and barns and stacks, and nothing else but those brown and grey waters. Then Jaywick, a deserted village, compact, empty, washed and split by the waters. Nearby, a big caravan site that took the full force of the sea, and from above the colours of the caravan looked oddly gay, like floating bits of confetti, till you came down and saw that they were homes, split open, torn apart, hurled together, gone and finished.
On Canvey Island, Shirley Thomas, then a girl of 12, was one of many people who had to take refuge with her family in their loft. When they were rescued, she and her sister were separated from their parents. They were taken to a school in Benfleet and then to the home of a local family. Meanwhile, their mother was taken to hospital ill through shock and exposure as their father desperately tried to find his daughters.
He went to all of the centres where rescued people had been taken and found that there were lists made of every rescued person, but my sister and I featured on none of these lists. Obviously, maybe being 12 years old or not, I had not noticed that everybody was writing their names on the blackboard in the schools that they were taken to, and I hadn't done it. So for a couple of days my father hunted in vain for his 2 girls, having to go back each evening to the hospital to my mother and saying, "I'm sorry, but I haven't found them." But eventually somebody in Benfleet remembered seeing 2 little girls, and luckily my sister was a redhead, so it had stuck in their mind that one of the children had been a redhead. And the man was traced, and I can still remember my father crying. I never saw him cry again in his lifetime. And when he knocked on the door and I opened it, that was all he did. He just collapsed in tears.
When the water reached Jaywick, it rose so fast in some places that people were drowned as they slept. In Brooklands, damaged caravans were strewn everywhere. Peter Wright had travelled from Frinton to check on his family. He helped in the rescue operation.
After we had sort of found our feet, we realised then that most of the survivors who were alive had already been rescued. And then it was decided that we had to look for people who are yet unaccounted for. I teamed up with our local milkman. We got a dinghy and we rowed down Meadow Way to various houses, or bungalows as they were, where he delivered the milk. And I'm very sorry to say that we found 8 people who had drowned. This was a very harrowing experience for me as a young man. I'd never seen a drowned person, let alone handled them. With the dinghy, we actually towed 2 of them behind the dinghy to the edge of the water, where another colleague of mine brought our van, and we put them in the van, and they were driven to the Cafe Morocco, where P.C. Mitchell identified them. When Jimmy and I were in the dinghy and we were rowing up Meadow Way, or an area adjacent to that, we came to one bungalow and he said, "Oh, we better look here. Oh, it looks as if they've got out." He said, "I'll have to catch up with him because he hasn't paid his milk bill for 3 weeks." And I can remember that to this day. When I first got to our house and spoke to my uncle and said that the water at the petrol station was right up to the top of the petrol pumps, he said I must get down there if I possibly can with a camera and take a photograph of that, because there's enough water in the petrol as it is, and petrol pumps with just the sign showing is something that's got to be recorded.
In Tilbury, 6,000 people had to leave their homes. The water covered the lower part of the town and was more than waist deep in the streets. Plant at the sewage works was submerged, cutting off the water supply and causing a dreadful smell. But there was a funny side too to the floodwaters of 50 years ago. Wyn Henry describes the scene at her house in Spencer Walk.
Even the stuff that came out, the pantries swimming, there was eggs and bacon and lard and everything swimming all over the room, the kids' clothes. And my poor husband, my mother lived across the road at the time, on her own, and I said to him, "We must go and get Mum." So he said, "Well, I must have a dry pair of trousers to take up there." Putting across it with a dry pair of trousers under his arm, Gets as far as there, forgot there was a curb, and down he went, so down went his trousers as well. So he didn't have a pair of dry trousers then, did he?
Childhood friends Josie Brown and Jackie Dinmore lived on Canvey Island and were both 11 in 1953. They have some unusual memories of the great tide.
When we came back during the morning, the strange thing was the tide had actually gone out, and because the water had receded, and I remember seeing a lot of dead worms floating about, and our chickens were all sitting on their perches. They couldn't get on the ground, and sitting on my dad's table in the shed.
When the tide went out, of course all the water went out of the house. So they thought that was the finish of it, not knowing obviously how badly it was affected. So there was the brooms and the sweeping and the cleaning and clearing all the muck and the mud, and the various worms and things that had come in through the front door all had to be cleared out. And in fact, my mother cooked the Sunday joint, which, before the water had gone out, was brought into us by canoe from our butcher, who lived 2 or 3 doors up the road from us. And my mother actually cooked the joint and all the veg to go with it. But she'd hardly finished doing so when the water all started coming back in again, because the tide came back in and we were back to square one again.
A milk lorry, the only lorry that could get down our road, was quite a high one because of the water getting in the exhaust. And of course, as it went down the road, I think every wooden fence in Atherstone Road keeled over. I remember being quite amused by that.
The late Bernard Brain had been elected as the MP for the Billericay division in 1950. For him, the plight of his constituents on Canvey Island was of paramount importance. He remembered addressing the House of Commons in an emergency debate on the flood disaster.
It was essential, I think, to those of us who had seen what had happened, who'd been in touch with those who were handling the rescue efforts. It was essential that Parliament should be told what was needed there and then to help those who had lost their homes, lost everything. So I told the House of Commons. It listened raptly. I told them the experience that I'd had, what I'd been told, the scene that I saw when I arrived, and so on. It was essential to get the government moving to assure people who'd lost their homes that steps would be taken to get things back into some sort of order. So I spoke from the heart.
The Mammoth rescue and clear-up operation involved not only the emergency services but a large number of organisations and many volunteers. 5,000 troops were deployed in Essex. There were nearly 900 breaches in the county's 300 miles of sea wall. Joe Sheffield was the Chief Assistant Engineer for the Essex Rivers Catchment Board.
I was so sorry for what the damage I'd seen and the distress of people, but once after the first 2 days my mind was focused on getting things put right as quickly as possible, safe as quickly as possible. After all, in 40 days we made most of the walls safe, but they weren't rebuilt to any height. They were just built sufficiently safe to keep out the equinoctial spring tide. Then we went on 5 years after that, rebuilding up to the levels required of 2 feet and 3 feet above 53 tide. There were a lot of sandbags where it was probably 2 feet, 2.5 feet knocked off, and we brought the height crest of the wall back to roughly what it was before. But where the wall had been sliced and it was up to 3 or 4 feet lower, I decided to employ building virtually 2 lines of timber walls with short piles and dropping sandbags in between. The large breaches with a pile framework and then raised with a concrete bag wall inside a cage, and then finally backed up with the machines.
The Army, Navy and Air Force made a major contribution. Among the soldiers were Bill Wood in the XPs based at Shoebury-Ness and Mike Farley, a drill instructor in the Irish Guards at Caterham. They were drafted in at Foulness Island and at Purfleet.
There was a 1.5 mile breach in the seawall, which took a lot of sandbags, and they had to keep changing the troops because it was very cold, and it took a lot out of everybody because nobody slept. He's always drunk, he's ate hot tea and soup, and that was it. You know, you just work. I was a driver, I just delivered, but when I see them stripped off in midwinter, filling sandbags, worn out, it just amazed me when people got together how they done it.
We were strung out in a line, and these amphibious ducks, manned by Royal Engineers, came along with the loaded sandbags, handed them to us who were standing at various depths in the water, and taking deep breaths and plunging them under water. It was pretty cold.
The fact that the Navy were supplying their men with a tot of rum in the morning or a tot of rum in the afternoon as part of the action to try and keep them going and keep warm, was noted by my own workmen, and they asked for it. The Air Force also noted it, and the Army, and for a short period I became also a wholesale rum supplier to 2,300 troops, plus my own men. But I decided that after the temperature rose 3 degrees above zero, the rum supplies would stop as it was getting expensive.
A huge lake of muddy salt water. This was the site of the Purfleet margarine factory of Vandenbergs and Jurgens that first Sunday in February 1953. Irresistibly, within an hour of midnight, a tide of unprecedented height had swept up the estuary with a 100-mile-an-hour gale howling behind it. Breaking through the wall and surging inland in a vast semicircle, it had engulfed the factory from behind. And in 2 hours, the site was under 20 million tons of water, rising and falling with the tide outside. It was quickly clear that the Purfleet factory, situated on low-lying ground, was worst hit of all. Through the whole great works the flood had swept, suddenly and without warning. Within those 2 hours, disaster was complete, and over what had been a spotless, shining plant lay 15 feet of water, salt-laden, dirty, corrosive. For 5 unbroken miles that Sunday morning, to all intents and purposes, Purfleet was in the river.
A Vandenbergs and Jurgens company film detailed the devastation at Purfleet to one of many industrial sites. Colne Point between Jaywick and Brightlingsea is one of the most exposed parts of the Essex coast. 50 years ago, 19-year-old Malcolm McGregor lived with his mum and dad, 17-year-old brother and 9-year-old sister. Their isolated bungalow was surrounded by the sea. Malcolm got a boat and for 3 hours in the darkness rowed to the nearest farm across the marshes at Lee Wick and safety, his sister's pony behind them.
Torrential torrent that came through over those saltings, and we had all the full force of the River Colne and coming right the way across from Mersey and the Blackwater was roaring through that gap. There were telegraph poles going along, pitch poling. When they would hit the ground, they were actually pitch poling and going over and over. You could see them leaping up in the air. Haystacks whizzing past, all sorts of things. And when we got nearly under the land to within about 100 yards of actual safety, my brother got caught up in a wire, in a fence. We'd been rowing and getting out and pushing and up to our shoulders and doing all sorts of things, trying to get clear of the various objects which were coming down and past us. And she spun round and I thought he was going to be ended up hanging on a fence, you know. He kicked and struggled and eventually he got free. And we got underneath the land and that was it, we got ashore. We were so cold we could hardly talk. Luckily Mum and Dad and my sister, they didn't get wet because they were actually in the boat. We got out of it at times, we had to. That little old pony, my sister kept calling her name all night, and that pony swam with us all the way.
Many other animals weren't so lucky. A lot of livestock in Essex had a watery grave. Dead sheep were found caught up in wire fences. Terrified pigs squealed out in anguish. Partridges and pheasants were overwhelmed by the tide. Many animals ended up in strange places. There were rabbits in trees and hens on roofs. On Foulness Island, a lot of cattle managed to survive. Many stampeded, converging on the churchyard, which was the highest point of the island. They were later rounded up. Horses, too, were rescued from the water. At Oxenham Farm at Great Wakering, John Threadgold recalls one horse's incredible escape.
Blossom, her name was. She was a blue roan mare, and she got out onto the sea wall. And in April she had twin foals, and twins are extremely unusual anyway with horses, and for them to live and survive, you know, it's even more unusual. one of the horses, he almost got out. There was a chain went between him and the stallion in the stable, and he got that wrapped round his fetlock once. And he was out apart from his hind leg, and it was right down to the bone. He was just one leg hanging over the end of the stable door, holding him back. And the pony that we had, she used to swim across Russley regularly. Oh, and she's almost like a fish. She got drowned. She come out of her box and went in the cowshed. And she went in amongst the cows, and I suppose she got trapped in there.
The St John Ambulance Brigade, the Red Cross, the Women's Voluntary Service and many other groups and individuals played a vital role in the welfare of the rescued and the rescuers. The thousands of Essex people who had to leave their homes were taken to schools, halls and people's homes for refuge. The late Bernard Brain MP visited survivors of the disaster.
Canby, which turned out to be the worst affected of all the districts flooded down the East Coast. Its people behaved in a truly heroic way. People rallied to help neighbours. There were some remarkable rescue stories. I remember later on visiting one of the rest centres, and there was one old lady who, I think she still had her nightie on, but she was wrapped in a couple of blankets, and she was having a cup of tea or something hot. And I asked her how she felt. I tried to comfort her, put my arm round her, and she said, "You know, Mr. Brain," she said, "I went all the way through the war. But to think that little old Hitler couldn't get me off that island, but that a drop of water's done it, he fair goes against the grain." And that was the spirit. That was the spirit. I remember another lady I visited later in hospital, who very nearly lost her life in Newlands. She told me how she'd wakened with the water soaking her bedclothes. She got up and she realised that she could see the water coming in. There was only one thing for her, and that was to get onto a chest of drawers. And there she actually stood.
I was so exhausted by standing, I tried to get down on the table to sit, but I lost my balance and my feet and legs went in the water. And the water then was coming right up. I sat like that until I was rescued on Tuesday.
On Tuesday?
On Tuesday about 4 o'clock.
But you must have been there for 3 days.
Yes, I was there for 3 days. The milk was on the table if I could only get that, but I couldn't.
Yes.
And I had a nice little bottle of whiskey my daughter brought me home from Ireland.
Yes. Where was that?
That was in the dressing table drawer in the bedroom.
That's the place to keep it.
Yes. Well, I couldn't get it, so I had nothing at all until they got me to the hospital.
But you were conscious the whole time? You
well,
remember?
I kept losing myself. Yeah. But I knew I'd got to keep my senses, otherwise I should have gone into the water. I fought against sleep and I fought against unconsciousness.
The late Bernard Brain talking to Mrs. Rudd in a BBC interview recorded in 1953. There was royal concern in the aftermath of the Great Tide. Her Majesty visited evacuees in Tilbury. Win Henry, with her husband and children, was one of those who was introduced to the young Queen.
It was all in this big circle, and when she came to the end of the circle, which she'd go in at, she stopped and spoke to myself and my husband. We had the counsellor with her, and of course once she stopped, every newspaper man was flick, 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 wasn't it? And she said, the weather doesn't help her, she said, to dry out. Very sympathetic. And how did the little children look as nice as they did sitting there with the clothes? I said, we happened to, fact a few with us. Came back and got a few, kept them nice and tidy. But she was very, very nice, very sympathetic. And of course it was all the local papers, wasn't it? And of course someone said, oh, it would have to be you.
The Queen Mother and Princess Margaret visited a school in South Benfleet where flood victims from Canvey Island were being looked after. An event witnessed by Ray Howard, now a borough and county councillor, but then a boy of 11.
Certainly, without doubt, they were very concerned, very, very concerned. It was a booster, and it was a booster to the people who had worked day in, night out, fighting to save lives, helping to try and put sandbags against the wall so that the incoming tide wasn't going to come back in and do further damage. The emergency people, the people who showed public-spirited support to try and do their utmost to help these unfortunate people, they were the people I feel who deserved to be introduced to the royal family. But the Queen Mum, in her usual nice, kind way, and indeed Princess Margaret, showed those thoughts, and I think it was a boost.
For farmers, agricultural land contaminated by seawater took years to properly return to fertility. Donations of food, clothing, household items and gifts were sent from home and abroad. Letters of sympathy were sent from all over the world, and flood relief funds were set up to compensate victims. Over the weeks and months following the 1953 floods, people gradually went back to their homes to survey the damage and begin the enormous clear-up operation. Places like Canvey, Foulness, Jaywick, Harwich and Tilbury did rise again, but 119 Essex people never did return.
We're dancing inside where it's smoky and warm. The music disguises the howls of the storm. The staff on this pier fear that something's not right, for the tide's running high for this time of the night. And the wind's getting stronger and the sea's breaking through. If water keeps rising, then what shall we do? The wind has increased from a fresh to a strong. You can read from their faces that something is wrong.
They turned around and said, you've got to get Olive and the kids dressed. They're evacuating the island. The island's flooded. In the meantime, I was out of bed and got the kids dressed, because he said he's never seen me move so quick in all my life.
Back home on the island, well, they're sleeping so sound, unaware of the flooding on the low-lying ground. Dear God, there's no stopping the strength of the sea on a cruel winter's ending for January. And the Saturday dancers are clearing the floor. It's getting on midnight, we can't dance no more. So come leave this ballroom that stands on the pier and head for the same coach that brought us down here.
It was a pretty gruesome sight. You could sense that there was death around the place. We knew a lot of people had been drowned and were still in some of the houses, but there was a funny feeling being down there. Might be on a battlefield.
There's no real escape, for once you're outside, just open these doors for one hell of a ride. Out from your shelter, your face will turn blue. Staggering, leaning, the wind cuts you through. And Peter Pan's playground has sunk from our sight. You can make out one rooftop that's catching some light. The police are arriving, so it's looking quite bad. Maybe the worst flooding that we've ever had.